He stormed into the cafe to fire her, then froze. His mute sons were laughing, clapping, and talking. After years of silence, one word shattered everything: Daddy. But what did this nanny really do to break the curse no doctor could fix? And why did their first word leave the billionaire speechless? Jimmy Long stood frozen in the entrance of the quiet cafe, his tailored suit stark against the warm afternoon light. At a small table by the window, his twin sons, Jimmy Bezenson and Jimmy Gonzalez, sat giggling and clapping their hands to a rhythm only they and their nanny seemed to understand. He blinked. It couldn't be. They were laughing. He took a step forward, his voice cutting through the cafe like a blade. What in God's name is going on here? The woman turned. Diane Tanui, wearing a burgundy uniform and yellow gloves, didn't flinch. She met his fury with something close to calm, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. You took them out without permission, Jimmy snapped. You disobeyed me. You risked. Before he could finish, both boys turned toward the sound of his voice, and for the first time in their lives, they opened their mouths. Daddy, they shouted, beaming. Their voices were high, joyful, unmistakable. Jimmy's briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. He didn't even notice. Tanuye's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the boys. They said it, Jimmy whispered, barely breathing. They actually said, they've been trying, she said gently, her voice thick. They just needed someone to listen. Jimmy didn't speak. He couldn't. But to understand how a billionaire obsessed with silence ended up hearing the one thing he never expected. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the story. We have to go back to the day Diane Tanuye first walked through the doors of the Long estate and into the heart of a family that had forgotten how to feel. But to understand how a billionaire obsessed with silence ended up hearing the one thing he never expected, we have to go back to the day the silence began. 3 years earlier. The Long estate, perched high above the river with its slate rooftops and perfectly trimmed hedges, was worth nearly $80 million. Inside, the air was always cool, the marble always polished, and the silence absolute. The home had once echoed with laughter and music, fresh flowers in every room, sunlight pouring through the windows. But that was before the emergency C-section, before the doctors told Jimmy Long they had saved the twins, but not their mother, before the day he came home from the hospital holding 2 infants in a car seat, and not holding his wife's hand. Her name had been Anna. He hadn't even been there when she died. He was in a conference room 4,000 miles away, finalizing a merger. He remembered the plane ride back, silent, sleepless, senseless. The twins were just hours old when he met them, tiny, fragile, wordless, just like him. The funeral was televised, a golden casket, dozens of white roses, a eulogy written by a publicist. Jimmy wore his grief like a custom suit, tailored and impenetrable. When asked how he was coping, he gave polite, hollow replies. But the house told the truth. He stripped the nursery of its color. Soft yellows and blues were replaced with gray. All toys that made sound were boxed up and sent away. Music, Anna's favorite, was never played again. Her grand piano was locked, the key hidden in his desk drawer. The mansion became a shrine, clean, still, controlled. The staff were instructed to keep voices low, footsteps silent, curtains drawn, and the twins, Jimmy Bezenson and Jimmy Gonzalez, grew up in it like flowers pressed between the pages of a closed book. They didn't cry. Not once, not when they were hungry. Not when they were tired. Not when they scraped knees, or got fevers, or watched nannies walk out the front door. They made no sounds at all. They sat where they were placed, stared at the same corners, blinked slowly, moved only when gently prompted. Beautiful boys, mirror images of their mother, with her dark curls and dimpled cheeks. And yet, ghostly. Jimmy took them to every expert imaginable. Neurologists scanned their brains, speech therapists ran evaluations, psychologists administered tests. They're physically healthy, one doctor said, but emotionally frozen. Frozen, like everything else in that house. One specialist called it selective mutism. Another said trauma response. One particularly expensive expert simply said, "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Jimmy asked. The woman looked at him gently. "To feel safe enough to begin." But Jimmy didn't understand safety. He understood order, results, control. He doubled the staff, hired tutors, installed surveillance cameras in every room with audio recording. He scheduled their lives down to the minute. Feedings, naps, playtime, therapy. 5 nannies came and went in the first year. The 6th lasted just 2 weeks. The 7th, hired on Christmas Eve, quit before New Year's, leaving behind a single line on her resignation form: "There's no air in that house. Only silence." Staff whispered that the mansion was cursed. They said Jimmy Long wasn't grieving. He was punishing himself. That he blamed the twins for her death. That the boys, in turn, had swallowed their voices like a secret they were too afraid to share. Maybe they weren't wrong. Still, Jimmy functioned. On paper, he thrived. His company, Longtech, hit record profits. He became the face of modern resilience. Widower, visionary, father of twins. His image was everywhere: magazine covers, talk shows, financial forecasts. But behind the front gates, his life was a blueprint of avoidance. He couldn't look at the boys without seeing Anna. Couldn't hear them without imagining the cries he never heard in the hospital delivery room. Couldn't hold them without feeling the weight of what he'd lost. So, he didn't. The one rule every new hire had to memorize was written at the top of the household manual, underlined in bold: keep things quiet. The twins turned 1, then 2. They still hadn't spoken a word. Not "dada," not "mama," not even nonsense sounds. Nothing. Their eyes followed people, but their mouths stayed closed. They would occasionally hum under their breath, barely audible, like they were testing the air. But as soon as anyone turned to listen, they'd go still again. Jimmy watched them one night from his study. The surveillance feed glowing on his screen. 2 toddlers sitting side by side in the nursery, not playing, not interacting, just waiting. He shut the laptop. In private, Jimmy started to believe something darker. Maybe they knew. Maybe, on some level, the boys remembered that their father wasn't there when their mother died. Maybe they were born grieving. Maybe their silence was justice. It was a thought that haunted him in the quiet hours. And so, the house endured. Room after room full of lightless chandeliers and untouched books. Hallways that echoed only with the soft patter of slippers and the turning of clocks. A mausoleum. Not a home. Then, one day, a new resume landed on the housekeeper's desk. It didn't come from the elite agencies Jimmy usually relied on. The credentials weren't gilded with Ivy League certifications or European languages, but the letter stood out, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. There were no boasts, no promises, just a single line scribbled in blue ink at the bottom. I know what silence means, and I'm not afraid of it. That resume belonged to Diane Tanouye, and she was about to open a door in the long estate no one had dared to touch in 3 years. The resume was thin. No Ivy League degrees. No published books on child psychology. No foreign languages. No elite family placements. Just a quiet history. 8 years of childcare experience, a 2-year degree from a community college in Louisiana, and a handwritten note at the bottom. I believe children don't need perfection. They need presence. Diane Tanouye, 28 years old. Born and raised in New Orleans. No nonsense, no frills, and completely off-brand for the long estate. The agency had sent her name almost as a joke. The head of placement called ahead to warn Mrs. Miller, the housekeeper. She's not what Mr. Long usually wants, the woman had said. But she's what those boys need. She arrived on a Thursday. Gray sky, wet sidewalks, one suitcase in each hand and a pair of yellow dish gloves tucked in her back pocket. She wore a burgundy blouse, jeans, and boots worn thin at the heel. Her hair was pulled back into a low twist. Her face unreadable. Mrs. Miller met her at the gate. "You're sure about this?" she asked, scanning Diane up and down. Diane nodded. "The boys are still not speaking?" "No words, not a sound. Mr. Long insists there's no need to discuss it with them." Diane raised an eyebrow. "Does he live here or just haunt the place?" Mrs. Miller's lips twitched. "Bit of both." The interview was scheduled for 10 minutes. It lasted 13. Jimmy Long sat behind his desk, the lights in his home office too dim for the time of day. The windows were closed. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and paper. He didn't look up as Diane entered. "Miss Tanouye," he said, "your file has gaps." "Your children haven't spoken in 3 years," she replied. "Seems we're all a little incomplete." That made him look up. She stood there, no nerves, no flattery, just stillness, like she'd walked through grief before and hadn't flinched. He gestured to the chair. She didn't sit. "I run a very structured home," he said, flipping open a binder labeled Daily Operations. "The boys follow a set schedule. Feedings, naps, therapy blocks. It's all in here. I expect it followed exactly." Diane glanced at the tabs, color-coded, laminated. "Do they follow the schedule?" Jimmy's mouth tightened. "That's the expectation." "That's not what I asked." He said nothing. Diane took a step forward, her voice low and even. "Mr. Long, when was the last time you sat on the floor with your sons?" Jimmy blinked. "Excuse me?" "On the floor. With them. Just present. Not managing, not watching through a monitor. Just there." He didn't answer. She let the silence hang. "I'll follow your rules, Mr. Long, until they stop serving your children." His jaw clenched. "Is that a threat?" "No," she said. "It's a promise." He hired her on the spot. Not because he trusted her, but because something in her voice sounded like the truth, and he was too tired to keep pretending he didn't want to hear it. Her room was on the 2nd floor, across the hall from the nursery. Spacious, with a window that overlooked the east garden. The walls were bare. The bookshelves full, but untouched. She unpacked quickly. A few changes of clothes. A notebook. Her grandmother's old Bible. Corners soft from use. and a tattered children's book of lullabies, the cover held together with tape. At 8:00 a.m. the next morning, she reported for duty. No one met her at the door. No one needed to. She knew where to go. The nursery was spotless. Rows of pristine toys still in their boxes. Plush animals arranged like museum pieces. A playmat in the center of the room, untouched. And in the middle of it all, the twins. Jimmy Bezanson and Jimmy Gonzalez, sitting side by side, not moving, their dark eyes tracking nothing, their fingers resting limp on their laps, identical in posture, in silence, in stillness. Diane stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, slow and quiet. She didn't speak. She didn't kneel right away. She sat beside them, not across, not looming, beside, like she was one of them. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out the yellow gloves. "Every superhero's got a costume," she whispered. They didn't blink. She smiled anyway. Then she hummed, softly at first, a tune from her childhood, half gospel, half jazz, something her grandmother used to sing while cooking dinner or mending socks. It wasn't a children's song. It wasn't on any therapy playlist. But it was real and warm. The boys didn't move. But something shifted. A blink, a twitch in the left hand, a flicker of muscle near the jaw. And then, very slightly, one of them leaned closer. Not much, but enough. Diane kept humming. After a few minutes, she stopped and spoke her first words to them. "My name's Diane. I'm not here to fix you. I'm just here to be with you." The boys stared, and for the first time in their lives, they looked at someone, not past, not through. It lasted all of 3 seconds, but it was more than anyone else had ever gotten. That night, Mrs. Miller peeked into the nursery on her way to bed. She found Diane curled up on the floor, eyes closed, one twin asleep beside her, the other tucked under her arm. No sound, no schedule, just stillness. But not the dead kind, the living kind. The kind that comes before a bud blooms. In his office, Jimmy reviewed the surveillance footage like he did every night. He watched the scene unfold, Diane's hum, the boys' stillness, the moment they looked at her. He didn't know why it rattled him, maybe because he realized, with aching clarity, they had never looked at him that way. Not once. The schedule went missing on day 4. Not the original, of course. That one was still in its binder, color-coded and laminated, perched on the edge of the kitchen island like a commandment. But the copy Diane Tanuyi was supposed to follow, the one with 15-minute time blocks and bullet-pointed objectives, she accidentally left it in the laundry. It never made it back. Instead, she opened the windows. The nursery, once sealed tight like a museum exhibit, suddenly breathed. October wind rustled the sheer curtains. Sunlight spilled across the carpet. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something hopeful. She brought in a Bluetooth speaker and placed it near the bookshelf. During breakfast, she played soft jazz, Duke Ellington, Nina Simone, the kind of music with rhythm in its bones. Nothing loud, nothing overwhelming, just enough to make the silence bend. At first, the staff panicked. Mrs. Miller hesitated at the door. "Miss Tanuyi, Mr. Long prefers structure in the mornings." "I prefer pancakes and good music," Diane replied, flipping a spoon against the countertop in a gentle, rhythmic beat. Ting, 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 ting. The boys sat in their high chairs, eyes tracking the motion. They didn't smile. Not yet. But they were watching. Mrs. Miller didn't argue. She just backed out of the room slowly, like someone leaving a ceremony they didn't quite understand. By the end of the week, something had changed. It wasn't dramatic. The twins weren't suddenly singing or talking, but there were signs. Tiny ones. One morning, Diane tapped her fingers against the table during snack time. Just a soft rhythm, no melody. One twin, Jimmy Besançon, lifted his hand and twitched his fingers, echoing her pattern without looking at her. The other, Jimmy Gonzalez, blinked twice when she started humming. Once for nothing, she murmured to herself, twice for noticing. She called them music moments. They didn't involve instruments, just sound and rhythm and space. She drummed gently on the kitchen island while they ate. She tapped the spoons against their cups. Ding, ding, da, ding. She whistled softly when folding their clothes. No instructions, no coaxing, just presence, layered in rhythm, wrapped in warmth, and the boys began to change. By the end of the second week, they were following her with their eyes. By the third, they were following her with their feet, toddling behind her like ducklings, giggling without sound. It wasn't laughter in the traditional sense. No noise came out, but their mouths opened, their cheeks lifted, their bodies shook. It was silent joy, but joy nonetheless. Jimmy Long noticed. Of course he did. He always reviewed the camera footage, always scrolled through the daily logs, though Diane had stopped filling them out after day 6. When Mrs. Miller asked why, Diane had simply said, "Mr. Long can hear the difference himself." One evening, Jimmy paused the security feed mid-frame. The image showed Diane sitting on the nursery floor, both twins in her lap, tapping their hands against her knees in perfect sync. She wasn't giving instructions. She wasn't asking anything. She was just being, and they were responding. He didn't like it, not because it was wrong, because it wasn't his way. The control he had clung to, the schedules, the therapy blocks, the measurable progress, none of it had worked. But this messy, unscripted hum of humanity, it was working, and he didn't understand it. The next morning, he appeared in the kitchen for the first time in over a week. He didn't say hello, just stood in the doorway in his tailored suit, watching as Diane flipped blueberry pancakes while humming a Louis Armstrong tune. The twins sat at the table, each holding a plastic spoon like a drumstick, softly tapping along. "Is this part of the plan?" Jimmy asked. Diane didn't turn around. "Nope." He cleared his throat. "Then, what is it?" She finally faced him. "It's breakfast." He frowned. "This isn't how we've handled mornings in the past." "Then it's a good thing it's not the past anymore." Jimmy said nothing. The boys giggled, still without sound, but unmistakably delighted, as Diane flipped a pancake in the air. One of them clapped. The other followed. Clap, 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 clap. The rhythm was alive. Later that day, Mrs. Miller found Jimmy standing alone in the hallway outside the nursery, listening through the door. Inside, Diane's voice floated out, a low hum wrapped around a whispered story. Something about a lion who forgot how to roar. The boys giggled again, softly smacking their palms against the rug. "I don't know what she's doing," Jimmy muttered. Mrs. Miller stood beside him. "Whatever it is, it's working." The house began to feel different. Not loud, but warmer, softer. There were still quiet hours. Still therapy appointments, but they no longer defined the day. Now breakfast had music, mid-mornings had dancing, afternoons had humming contests and finger drumming, and the twins, once ghosts, were now shadows that followed Diane from room to room, watching, waiting, mimicking, and sometimes, if the moment was just right, they smiled. Jimmy never smiled back. Not yet, but he was watching. And for a man who had spent 3 years ignoring the world inside his own home, watching was progress. One night, as Diane sat alone in the kitchen, Jimmy appeared again. No warning, no agenda. Just a man in a suit, standing in the same room where his sons had started to come alive. "Why music?" he asked quietly. She sipped her tea. "Because it's the first language every heart speaks." He leaned against the counter, his voice stiff. "And if it doesn't work?" "It already is." He didn't argue, just nodded once, and left. The first time Diane Tanouye asked to take the boys outside, Jimmy didn't even look up from his laptop. "No, they need a change of scenery," she said. "New sounds, new faces. It's part of the process." He kept typing. "They're not ready. They're not glass, Mr. Long. They're children." Now he looked up. His voice was quiet, but cold. "This house is the only place I know they're safe. That's not negotiable." Diane held his gaze. "They've been safe. What they haven't been is alive." He closed his laptop with a snap. "This conversation is over." But Diane knew something he didn't. She could feel it. In the way Jimmy Bezenson had started tapping his foot when she turned on Miles Davis. In the way Jimmy Gonzalez had begun whispering nonsense syllables under his breath when she hummed while folding laundry. There was a spark now, a rhythm. They were ready, even if their father wasn't. So she waited. Not for permission. For a sunny day. It came 2 mornings later. The sky was painted in clear blue. A breeze drifted through the open nursery window, carrying the scent of jasmine and something new. Diane laid out the boys' tiny sneakers, their matching navy jackets, and 2 snack containers filled with strawberries and crackers. She slipped a notebook and crayons into her tote, along with a damp cloth, a water bottle, and a backup plan she wouldn't need. She crouched beside the boys. "Do you want to go on an adventure?" They blinked. She smiled. That was a yes. By the time the staff realized what was happening, Diane and the twins were already through the side gate. The cafe sat along the river, just past the edge of the park, an unassuming place with outdoor tables, string lights, and the smell of fresh espresso that spilled onto the sidewalk. She had found it on her second day in the city, memorized the menu, watched the crowds. It was perfect. Not too loud, not too big. Just alive. They sat at a corner table near the window. Diane ordered a warm croissant, 2 apple juices, and 1 large coffee she didn't really need but would sip anyway. The boys sat in their booster seats, wide-eyed. They looked like explorers discovering a new world. The clatter of mugs, the hiss of the milk steamer, laughter from a couple 2 tables down. None of it scared them. They just stared, soaking it in. Diane pulled out 2 plastic spoons and laid them on the table. Then, with the croissant crumbs still warm between them, she tapped. Just once. Then again, rhythm. Steady, soft, tap, 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 tap. The boys watched. She added a hum beneath it, a deep, slow melody with no words, just feeling. Tap, 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 tap. Then she stopped, waited. Jimmy Bezenson reached out first. He mimicked the rhythm, sloppy, uneven, but intentional. Tap, tap. Tap, tap. Diane's heart caught. Jimmy Gonzalez laughed. Not a soundless giggle this time. A real sound. High-pitched. Breathless. A squeaky little burst that turned heads around the cafe. It was the first sound he'd ever made in public. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she leaned in. "Keep going, sweetheart." She tapped again, this time letting them lead. Jimmy Besenson followed, matching her beat almost exactly. Jimmy Gonzalez smacked his palms on the table and laughed again, louder. And then he opened his mouth. "Muh, muh, muh." Diane froze. "Muh, muh," he said again, blinking fast. It wasn't clear. It wasn't perfect. But it was a word. A sound. A miracle. The cafe seemed to pause around them. No one said a word. Diane placed her hand gently on the boy's chest, as if to make sure the sound had truly come from him. Then Jimmy Besenson joined in. "Da-da." His voice was rough, like a violin out of tune. Diane's eyes filled instantly, but she didn't reach for her phone. She didn't document it. She just smiled, leaned across the table and whispered, "There you are." She let them keep going. Gibberish sounds, rhythm play, broken syllables. A symphony of firsts. The world passed by outside the cafe windows. But inside, time folded in on itself. Nothing existed except those three hearts and the music between them. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. She only noticed when the boys stopped moving. Their heads turned, both at once, toward the door. Diane looked up, and there he was, Jimmy Long, frozen in the doorway, briefcase in one hand, disbelief in his eyes. "What?" he said hoarsely. "In God's name, is going on here?" He crossed the cafe in 3 long strides, eyes locked on Diane. "You took them out without my permission." His voice shook. "You disobeyed me. You put them in danger." He opened his mouth to say more, but then, "Daddy!" Jimmy Gonzalez shouted it, loud and clear. "Daddy!" his brother echoed. 2 voices, cracked and imperfect, but unmistakable. Jimmy's mouth hung open. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a thud. He didn't notice. He didn't move. He just stood there, speechless. The boys clapped, proud of themselves. Jimmy Gonzalez turned back to Diane and whispered, "Mama," again, reaching for her hand. She took it. Jimmy Long slowly sat down at the edge of their table, like a man returning to Earth after years on another planet. "They spoke," he whispered. Diane nodded, her voice soft but steady. "They've been trying." His eyes searched hers. "What did you do?" "I listened." Jimmy Long stormed through the cafe like a storm wrapped in a suit. Heads turned. A waitress stepped aside. The barista stopped steaming milk mid-pour. No one said a word. They didn't have to. The tension trailed behind him like smoke. His eyes locked on Diane Tanouye. She sat at a corner table, her burgundy blouse sunlit from the window behind her. In front of her sat the twins, his sons, giggling, tapping plastic spoons against the wooden surface like it was a drum line. They were laughing. They were clapping. And then, God help him, they were talking. "Daddy!" one of them had said. It echoed still, bouncing off his bones. But his anger was faster than his awe. "You took them out without my permission," he snapped, standing over the table like a shadow. "You disobeyed me. You broke the only rule I've made clear since the day you got here." Diane didn't flinch, but her hands were trembling slightly. She rested them gently over the boys as they kept drumming. "You said they weren't ready," she said quietly. "They're not." "They are," she replied. "You're the one who's not." Jimmy opened his mouth to fire her, really fire her. But the moment wouldn't let him, because right then Jimmy Besenson looked up and shouted, Dada! And then Jimmy Gonzalez, smaller, softer, leaned into Diane's shoulder and whispered, Mama. The spoons dropped to the table. Time stopped. Jimmy Long, the billionaire, the empire builder, the man who hadn't cried since the day he buried his wife, sat down in the booth across from them like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. His voice came out like sandpaper. They spoke. Diane nodded once. Her throat worked hard to swallow something rising fast. Yes, he blinked. How? She exhaled, slow and steady. They didn't need therapy, Mr. Long. They needed to be heard. That undid him. Not the miracle. Not the noise. Not even the word Daddy that he didn't speak. Didn't blink. For the first time in 3 years, Jimmy Long was the one who went silent. The twins were still playing, rhythmic, happy, tapping and humming their way through the world like it had never been closed off to them. He watched them with an expression that didn't know how to belong on his face. Wonder, grief, awe, regret. They were supposed to be broken, he said, not to Diane, not even to himself, but to the ghost that had followed him into that cafe. They weren't, she replied gently. They were just waiting for someone to show them the world had sound. He looked up. And you thought it was your job to be that someone? No, she said. I knew it was. Jimmy leaned back in the booth, hands flat on the table. When I saw your resume, I thought it was too thin, not clinical enough, not official. I'm not official, she said. I'm intentional. He laughed once, just air, no humor. You're also fired. Diane blinked, the only crack in her calm. Understood, she said, voice even, but Jimmy held up a hand. Or I was going to fire you. He stared at the boys, who were now feeding each other cracker crumbs with sticky fingers. But now, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Diane folded her hands in her lap, quiet. They didn't do this for me, she said. They did it because someone made space. Someone trusted them to find the beat in the noise. Jimmy looked at her like he was staring down a foreign language, one he'd once spoken fluently, in a life before loss. I gave them everything, he murmured. She nodded. Except yourself. The silence between them was dense, heavy, sacred. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, just honoring. Finally, Jimmy spoke again. This time his voice didn't sound like a CEO's. It sounded like a man trying to learn how to feel again. You really believe this is how it starts? I know it is. And what comes next? Diane looked over at the boys, both now trying to balance spoons on their noses. Next comes the part where you stop managing them, she said, and start loving them out loud. But when Jimmy Gonzalez looked up and said, Mama, again, this time with a grin, Jimmy Long did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled. They sat there a little longer. No more arguing, no more demands, just stillness, and the sweet, uncertain beginning of a family learning how to make noise together. The house was quiet again, not the cold, oppressive silence that had once haunted the marble halls, but a softer stillness, the kind that comes after something sacred has broken open. Jimmy Long stood in the doorway of his study, staring at the fire he hadn't lit in 3 years. He didn't know why he'd done it tonight. Maybe he just needed proof that warmth could still exist in this house. The flames flickered against the dark paneled walls, casting slow shadows across the floor. He poured a drink, then set it down untouched, and picked up the phone. Diane arrived 5 minutes later, still wearing the same burgundy blouse from the cafe, faint coffee stains on her cuffs. Her face was unreadable. She stepped into the study and closed the door behind her. Jimmy didn't say anything at first. He just gestured toward the leather armchair across from his desk. She sat. He didn't. He stayed standing, one hand on the mantel, the other gripping the edge of the fireplace, like it might anchor him to the moment. "I'm not firing you," he said finally. Diane nodded once. "I know." He let out a breath and crossed to the window, looking out over the garden. The same garden where Anna had once danced barefoot under the moonlight, pregnant with the twins, her laughter rising into the warm summer air. Jimmy swallowed hard. "They spoke today." Diane said nothing. "They laughed, they smiled, he exhaled. "They were alive." Still, she didn't speak, and that somehow gave him permission. "I wasn't there," he said. "The night Anna died." His voice cracked on her name. "I was in Tokyo, in a boardroom, closing a deal that added another zero to the company's valuation. And while I was reviewing merger documents, she was being rushed into emergency surgery." He turned back toward the fire, his face lined with something far older than his years. "They called me too late. By the time my jet took off, it was over. She was gone. And the boys, they came into the world crying, I'm told. But by the time I got to them, they were silent, and they stayed that way." Diane's eyes softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I thought," he paused, "I thought maybe it was divine punishment, that I'd made a choice, even if I didn't mean to. I chose work over her, and the universe took her from me, left me with two sons I didn't know how to love. Two boys who, when they stopped making noise, I assumed were just reflecting what I deserved." His voice faded to a whisper. "I believed their silence was my fault." Diane leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Long, Jimmy." He met her gaze for the first time. "My name is Jimmy." She nodded. "All right, Jimmy." He waited. And then she said it, soft but firm. "Grief that's never spoken becomes inherited silence." It landed like a truth he'd known but never named. He sank into the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, eyes lost in the carpet. "They remind me of her," he murmured. "Every time I look at them. Her curls, her smile, her eyes." Diane waited. "And sometimes," he continued, "I thought if I could keep everything perfectly controlled, if I could schedule away the pain, clean the house into submission, run the company like a machine, maybe I wouldn't have to feel it." "And did it work?" she asked. He shook his head. "It never even came close." Silence settled between them again, but this one was earned, safe. "I don't know how to fix this," Jimmy said finally. "You don't need to fix anything," Diane replied. "You just need to show up." "I don't know if I can be what they need." "Yes, you do," she said. "Because today, you listened." He looked at her. "I don't want you to be their nanny anymore," he said. Her eyes flickered. "I want you to stay. Not as staff. As something else, someone who helps me figure this out. Someone who sees what I can't. Someone who knows when to break the rules and when to let go." Diane's hands folded in her lap. "I didn't take this job for the title, Jimmy." "Why did you take it?" She smiled faintly. "Because I saw two boys who were hurting in a way I understood. And I saw a father who didn't know he was allowed to be broken too." Jimmy stood, crossed to the mantel again. This time, not to anchor himself, but to release something. I want to change. For them, for me, for whatever comes next. You can, she said. Will you help me? Yes, Diane replied, without hesitation. Outside, the fire in the study cast warm light onto the garden path. Upstairs, in the nursery, two small boys slept with their arms draped over each other, the faint rhythm of a lullaby Diane had once hummed still echoing in the air. And in the heart of a house that had once known only grief, something new began to grow. Not noise, not perfection, but presence. It started with the sound of spoons, tapping on countertops, clinking against mugs, beating out rhythms no one had taught, only remembered. Then came humming, soft at first, then louder. Diane sang during breakfast prep, the twins echoing her like tiny jazz singers in training. By the second week, laughter poured down the stairs like sunlight. The long estate, once a house of silence, had found its pulse again. Jimmy noticed the change not in one grand moment, but in dozens of quiet ones. His sons running barefoot through the hallway, crayon art on the fridge, crooked and wild, pillows thrown from the nursery couch during a make-believe thunderstorm. Noise, honest, glorious noise, filled the rooms he once kept locked in stillness. And with it, something in Jimmy began to shift. One night, Diane introduced something new. Story circles, she said. A family tradition where I'm from. She placed a small rug in the center of the den. Cushions formed a ring. A single candle flickered in the middle like a heartbeat. Each evening, just before bedtime, they sat in a circle. Jimmy, Diane, the twins, passing around a small wooden drum. Whoever held the drum shared a thought, a feeling, a memory. It didn't have to make sense. It just had to be true. At first, Jimmy only watched. Then one night, he reached for the drum. I used to be afraid of silence, he said. Diane met his gaze, steady. But I was more afraid of what I'd hear if it ever broke. The twins looked at him, confused but listening. Diane smiled softly. You're safe now, she said. He passed the drum to Jimmy Gonzalez, who immediately banged it with both hands like a wild percussionist. They all burst out laughing. The weeks passed. Vocabulary exploded. Juice, play, more, up, down, daddy, again. Each word was a miracle. Each sentence, a revolution. Jimmy took longer to adjust. He still held his phone like a shield in meetings. Still caught himself checking the clock during breakfast. But more often now, he let time bend. He sat on the floor. He sang off-key. He let the boys comb his hair into 3 ridiculous tufts one afternoon, just to hear them laugh. Then came the email. Subject line, urgent, Singapore transfer. It was from the board. The expansion deal Jimmy had been nurturing for years was ready. They wanted him overseas for 18 months, minimum. Offices, press, team relocation. His presence would signal stability, leadership, control. He read the email twice, then again, then he closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. That night at dinner, the boys told Diane about a dream. Big boat, big sky. She smiled and ruffled their hair. Sounds like an adventure. Jimmy said nothing. Later, he found Diane in the garden. She was trimming the rose bushes, wearing her yellow gloves, humming something wordless. He stood beside her for a full minute before speaking. They want me to go, he said. She didn't ask who they were. And do you want to go? I used to, he said. She nodded. But now? He looked toward the house. Inside, he could see the boys silhouetted against the nursery window, dancing to a song only they could hear. Now I think leaving would be the last decision I'd ever make as a father. The next morning, Jimmy called the board. He resigned from daily operations. He offered transition support and remote advisement, but made it clear. He was choosing home over empire. The fallout was swift. Investors questioned his priorities. Headlines speculated about burnout. Colleagues called him reckless. But Jimmy didn't flinch. He had made his billions in control. Now, he was learning how to live in surrender. That evening, he stood in the nursery doorway as Diane read the twins a bedtime story. Her voice was soft and sure. The boys were curled under one arm each, half asleep, safe. When the story ended, she kissed them both on the forehead and stood to leave. Jimmy stepped in. "I need to talk to you," he said. Downstairs in the study, the fire burned low again. He gestured for her to sit. This time he did too. "I'm not just staying here for the boys," he said. "I'm staying because I finally understand what this house was missing." She waited. "It wasn't a mother," he continued. "It wasn't more staff or therapy or better programs. It was someone who wasn't afraid to love them loudly." He swallowed. "They found their voices through you." Diane's eyes shimmered. "Help me make sure they never lose them." She didn't speak right away. Then, "Are you asking me to stay as their nanny?" "No," he said. "I'm asking you to stay as their guardian." With Mitur, he let that hang in the air. "I want them to grow up knowing they're loved by people who chose them. Not because of a job title or a bloodline, but because we showed up." Tears slipped down Diane's cheeks. "You really mean that?" "With everything I have left." She nodded. "Then yes," she whispered. "I'll stay." From the hallway, two tiny voices giggled. The boys had snuck out of bed. Diane opened her arms. They ran into them. Jimmy knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around all three. The candle in the den flickered. And outside, for the first time in years, the long estate didn't feel haunted. It felt like home. The long estate had never heard this much noise. Laughter spilled from the garden like music. Children raced barefoot across the lawn. Balloons bobbed in the wind, and the scent of vanilla cake mixed with warm summer air. The mansion that had once held its breath was now exhaling, slow, joyful, and loud. It was the twins' 4th birthday, and the house was alive. Paper lanterns floated from tree branches. Streamers lined the hedges. A makeshift stage, built by the staff, decorated by Diane and the boys, sat in the middle of the yard with a keyboard at its center. Diane Tanouye adjusted the microphone, her yellow gloves tucked in the waistband of her skirt. She tapped a few keys on the piano. The notes rang clear and bright. On either side of her stood Jimmy Besançon and Jimmy Gonzalez. Dressed in matching suspenders and lopsided paper crowns they had made themselves. Their eyes sparkled with anticipation and frosting. The crowd, friends, staff, neighbors, and a few stunned executives who had never seen their former CEO outside a suit, waited quietly. Then Diane gave a nod. The music began, a soft, simple melody, one she'd taught them in the nursery, humming it night after night until it became a lullaby, a language, a lifeline. The boys sang, clumsily, off-key, out of rhythm. It was perfect. They shouted the words like joy couldn't be contained, syllables tumbling over each other, laughter woven between every note. The guests clapped along, some smiling, some crying, all feeling the miracle of it. Jimmy Long stood behind them, still. He wore no tie, no cufflinks, just a button-down rolled to his elbows. His hands clasped in front of him as if in prayer. His eyes shimmered. He wasn't thinking about shareholders. He wasn't thinking about Singapore or sales charts or missed calls. He was thinking about two voices that, for so long, hadn't existed in the world. And now, here they were, singing. Alive. As the song ended, the boys turned toward Diane and shouted in unison, "Mama Tanuye, we love you!" The crowd erupted into applause. Diane covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. The boys ran to her, arms thrown around her waist. And Jimmy, standing in the sunlight, whispered just loud enough for no one to hear, speechless again. After cake and presents, after hugs and high fives, the crowd began to thin. Children were gathered, gifts packed, plates cleared. But the sound, the hum of life, lingered. Diane sat at the edge of the garden, watching the boys chase each other through the grass. Jimmy joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "They didn't even stop to open half their presents," he said. "They've already got what they need," Diane replied. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping quietly, the kind of stillness that wasn't empty anymore, but full of everything they had rebuilt. "You know," Jimmy said, his voice thoughtful, "this place used to echo with absence." Diane looked at him. "And now?" He smiled. "Now it echoes with sound I never thought I'd hear." She nudged his shoulder. "Turns out miracles are loud." "Turns out," he echoed. The boys came running back, cheeks flushed, crowns askew. "Again!" Jimmy Bezanson shouted, pointing at the piano. "Play the happy song," Gonzalez chimed in. Diane laughed. "One more time, but then it's bath and bedtime." "Birthday, boys." Jimmy stood and offered her a hand. "Let's do it." She looked at him, surprised. "You're going to sing?" "Maybe not loud," he said, grinning. "But I'll be present." They returned to the stage. The music played again, and this time Jimmy sang with them, just a few soft lines, a beat behind, but real and right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold over the estate's rooftops, the long house glowed from within. Through the open windows came the sound of music, of giggles, of stories, of love, not perfect, not rehearsed, but true. Because healing, it turned out, wasn't about finding the right words. It was about having the courage to speak at all, and letting the people around you love you through the cracks in your voice. That night, after the guests had left, and the boys were tucked into bed, Jimmy stood outside their door for a long while, listening, not for silence, but for the small, gentle sounds of safety, of breath, of presence, of home. He turned to find Diane behind him, barefoot, holding the old lullaby book in one hand. "I never got to say it properly," he said. "Say what?" "Thank you. For saving them." She stepped closer. "You think I saved them," she said softly. "But the truth is, they saved us." In the nursery, one of the boys stirred and murmured something in his sleep. A half-word, a half-dream. Diane smiled. "Still making music," she whispered. And as the last light flickered out, the only sound left in the house was laughter. Real, loud, and full of love.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.